Today, Congress released a report stating that in an unprecedented turn of events, they are going to allow the American people to vote on whether or not to posthumously impeach the deceased President Andrew Jackson. During his lifetime, Congress censured him for his actions, but now, almost 200 years later, Congress has decided that the reputation of the man whose face is centered on our $20 bills should be reevaluated. Since this is the first ever posthumous impeachment trial, Congress decided that the people should be the judge and jury, not Congress, as is usually the case. In this news update, we examine Jackson's war on the Second Bank of the United States, and if his actions taken during that bank war exceeded the powers legally granted to the President under the Constitution. To determine if his actions were indeed unconstitutional, and if he should be impeached, we must travel back in time and view a news clip from late 1837.
As banks and businesses close around town, the dire warnings of Henry Clay, Noah Webster, and Nicholas Biddle seem to have come true. But Jackson has vociferously protested that this current recession is due to external influences, not his own actions. In a recent letter to President Van Buren, Andrew Jackson wrote, My dear Sir, the Treasury order is popular with the people everywhere I have passed, but all the speculators and those largely indebted want more paper. The more it depreciates, the easier they can pay their debts. Check the paper mania and the republic is safe, and your administration must end in triumph. According to Massachusetts State Senator Daniel Webster, this is just the same old refrain Jackson's been singing all along. He takes unconstitutional and destructive actions, persuades the media and people that he has acted in their interest, and then, when his actions wreak havoc on the economy and on the common man, he makes a scapegoat out of the very people that care for the common man. The industries, the banks, and the investors. On today's program, we will have Webster and Nicholas Biddle, the president of the Second Bank of the United States, join us to share their opinions on the issue of the bank war and the legality of President Jackson's actions. After we have gotten their opinions on these recent developments, we'll turn to you, our viewers, for comments and rebuttals of their conversation. So be listening and be ready to call in at the conversation's end. Please welcome our distinguished guests. Welcome, gentlemen. Mr. Biddle, please share with the American public what exactly happened in the so-called bank war.
First, I would like to thank you for allowing me to be a guest on this program to share my view on this issue. I'm afraid that the President has constructed his agenda in such a way that the public fails to see the illegality of his actions. It is nice to be able to share the other side of the story. Well, I was appointed the President of the Second National Bank by President James Monroe in 1823. And under my direction, the bank became powerful once more. The national currency was strong, and it supported our growing economy. And the federal government approved of the constitutionality of this fine institution. My friend here, Daniel Webster, can tell you all about the constitutionality of the National Bank, as he is one of the nation's leading scholars and lawyers on constitutionality.
Thank you, Biddle, my friend. You're absolutely right that the constitutionality of the U.S. Bank has been approved many times. For example, in 1819 it was proved constitutional by the Supreme Court in the McCullough v. Maryland case that I worked on. Throughout and after this case, the U.S. Treasury, not to mention the American public, recognized its usefulness to the nation. However, that was not enough for Jackson's approval. He hated the bank and wanted it to die. In fact, he's even quoted saying, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." End quote. In December of 1829, Jackson attacked the bank, stating that it did not produce a stable currency and that it did not have constitutional legitimacy. Based on the previous statements made by Biddle and myself, you can see that the President's claims were false. Even when both houses of Congress launched investigations and concluded that the National Bank was constitutional and played an important role in the American economy, Jackson pursued with his own self-interest attacks.
That is very interesting, gentlemen. I am sure that many of our viewers were unaware of the support the bank held in the federal government. Biddle, please tell me more of Jackson's attack of the bank and your role in defending it.
I approached the President to come to a compromise on the issue of the rechartering of the bank, since I knew he was a bit touchy on the subject. However, Mr. Jackson refused to be reasonable and continued his attacks. This provoked Mr. Henry Clay, a staunch supporter of the bank, to issue an early rechartering of the bank, as an attempt to ensure Jackson could not destroy it. I placed my full support behind Clay in this endeavor, and thus with two strong sides of opposition, the bank war began. From there, Jackson vetoed the bill for the recharter of the bank, and, to my dismay, not only was the veto sustained, but Jackson was actually re-elected as president with his anti-bank platform. He made the American people believe that he is the defender of the common man. So if he says the bank hurts their self-interests, they believe it. This is not the first time that Mr. Jackson has gotten away with something illegal. His use of martial law in New Orleans, his disregard for Justice Marshall's decision regarding the Cherokee Indians, but I digress. Our focus is on the illegality of Jackson's actions regarding the Second National Bank, and I will let my good friend Daniel Webster tackle that, the expert of the Constitution that he is. However, before I turn to him, let me finish narrating the events of the bank war between Jackson and myself. After Jackson passed his veto, I tried to save the bank from the whims of Jackson, but my efforts were unsuccessful. From there, Jackson took it upon himself to bring in one crony after another into the position of the Secretary of the Treasury until he found a man that would execute his wish to remove the money from the National Bank and place it in smaller banks throughout the nation. These actions to undo all of the successful and hard work I put into the building of the National Bank unnerves me. And now we are faced with economic turmoil and what history will call the Panic of 1837. Some good Jackson brought to his people. Webster, sir, please take it over from there. This subject stirs up great wrath within me.
Thank you, Biddle. I will indeed share with the American people how Jackson acted against the laws of the Constitution. He even admitted to his inclination towards illegality. It has been my lot I quote, it has been my lot to be placed in situations of a critical kind that imposed on me the necessity of violating, or rather departing from, the Constitution of the country. End quote. I think the words I penned right after Jackson vetoed the bill are still very much true. In fact, their verity has, if anything, become more clear. Let me go ahead and read a portion of my speech to you. Quoting myself from the past, the bank bill, having been thus passed by both houses, and having been duly presented to the President, instead of signing and approving it, he has returned it with objections. These objections go against the whole substance of the law originally creating the bank. They deny, in effect, that the bank is constitutional. They deny that it is expedient. They deny that it is necessary for the public service. It is not to be doubted that the Constitution gives the President the power which he has now exercised. But while the power is admitted, the grounds upon which it has been exerted become fit subjects of examination. The Constitution makes it the duty of Congress in cases like this to reconsider the measure which they have passed, to weigh the force of the President's objections to that measure, and to take a new vote upon the question. Hitherto it has been thought that the final decision of the constitutional questions belonged to the Supreme Judicial Tribunal. It is true that each branch of the legislature has an undoubted right in the exercise of its functions to consider the constitutionality of a law proposed to be passed. This is naturally a part of its duty, and neither branch can be compelled to pass any law or do any other act which it deems to be beyond the reach of its constitutional power. After a law has been passed through all the requisite forms, after it has received the requisite legislative sanction and the executive approval, the question of its constitutionality then becomes a judicial question, and a judicial question alone. In the courts that question may be raised, argued, and adjudged. It can be adjudged nowhere else. The President is as much bound by the law as any private citizen, and can no more contest its validity than any private citizen. The President may say a law is unconstitutional, but he is not the judge. The judiciary alone
possesses this unquestionable and hitherto unquestioned right. It is to be remembered that it is the present charter of the bank which the President pronounces to be unconstitutional. It is no bank to be created. It is no law proposed to be passed, which he denounces. It is the law now existing, passed by Congress, approved by President Madison, and sanctioned by a solemn judgment of the Supreme Court, which he now declares unconstitutional. I again repeat that if the President sees fit to negative a bill, on the ground of its being inexpedient or impolitic, he has a right to do so. But remember that we are now on the constitutional question. Remember that the argument of the President is that because powers were given to the bank by the Charter of 1816, which he thinks unnecessary, that charter is unconstitutional.
Thank you, gentlemen. You have provided great insight into this national issue. Now we turn to our viewers at home. We ask you to call in to share your opinions on this debate. Do you have any comments on this bank war? Do you think President Jackson's actions are legal? Who do you side with? Has this issue affected you personally? It seems we have our first caller. Good evening. What is your name?
Good evening to you all as well. My name is Jane Doe. I voted for Jackson, but instead of helping me like he said he would, I was one of those poor common men. He messed everything up. I thought Jackson was exposing the biggest fraud ever, the bank. He convinced me that it was good for industries and thus bad for me. What I didn't realize was that while Biddle helped primarily industries, those were the same industries that bought my husband's crops and employed my in-laws. In other words, they were the companies that employed us. So all the support Biddle threw behind the industries was actually good for the common man, not bad like Jackson would have us believe. Not only that, but Biddle, who by the way, I loved until Jackson came on the scene, denouncing him as the traitor to the country, actually directly helped the common man more than Jackson told us he did. I think we all tended to believe Jackson just because he was the epitome of the American dream. He was a self-made man, a war hero, brave, but very much human. There was just something about him. But actions do speak louder than words, and although I voted for Jackson's words, I did not mean to vote for his subsequent actions. He was so good with words, though, that I didn't realize the havoc his actions were wreaking on the economy and the unity of our nation until after he left office and the panic of 1837 set in. My in-laws were laid off, and my husband can't make a profit off the land. Jackson's eloquence ruined my family's lives and professions, and he seems not to care.
Mrs. Doe, please share your opinion on this quote from Jackson. In administering the laws of Congress, I shall keep steadily in view the limitations as well as the extent of the executive power, trusting thereby to discharge the functions of my office without transcending its authority.
Well, as I said before, I think that he lied here. He said this, but then went on to become a suave King Jackson, deluding us all. I wish we would have realized what a rat he was before we elected him. I remember him saying that he was going to help and respect the Indians. Ha! The only way he helped them was by giving them a free ticket to heaven, if they were even religiousified by them, by forcing them to walk the Trail of Tears. I guess his form of respect is either dueling or killing.
Well, that is all the time we have for tonight. Thank you to all of our guests and viewers on this program. Have a good night.
So there you have it, folks. Stay tuned for more updates on this breaking news story of the 2014 trial to impeach the deceased Andrew Jackson. I hope the words of the men living in 1837 have helped make it clear that Jackson should have been punished for his actions that clearly disregarded the Constitution. Jackson is also being tried for his illegal actions in the nullification crisis of the 1830s and in his dealings with the Native Americans. Those two issues will be covered in subsequent programs, but I hope they will convince you to take this issue seriously as you decide whether or not to vote to impeach Jackson, a decision that will set the standard for the future governance of the United States.